Good evening, everyone. I'm Annabelle Gambert-Jouan, the Lillian and James Clark Assistant Curator of European Art here at the DMA. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the annual Rosenberg Fête celebrating French art of the 18th century. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Aaron Wile, I want to recognize the trustees of the Michael Rosenberg Foundation, Bob Harrison, Deb O'Gage, and Becky Todd, who are with us tonight, as well as Larry Barzoon, Chairman Emeritus, who retired from the foundation last year. 2023 marks 20 years since the passing of Michael Rosenberg. For the past 2 decades, the Rosenberg Foundation has contributed to the rayonnement, as we say in French, of the many facets of art and culture of 18th century France. The continued support of the Rosenberg Foundation makes possible this annual fête, including tonight's lecture, as well as activities like music and sketching in the galleries, which I hope you are able to enjoy. It is also through the generous support of the Rosenberg Foundation that we can display the Rosenberg Collection in our galleries and continue to share Michael Rosenberg's legacy. Now, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Aaron Wile, who is Associate Curator of French Paintings at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Dr. Wile received his PhD in the history of art and architecture from Harvard University and is a specialist in 17th and 18th century French art. Before joining the National Gallery, Dr. Wile was a fellow at the Centre Allemand d'Histoire de l'Art in Paris, at the Society of Fellows in the Humanities at USC, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and at the Frick Collection. While at the Frick, he organized the exhibition Watteau's Soldiers, Scenes of Military Life in 18th Century France, on the artist's early paintings and drawings of military subjects. At the National Gallery, Dr. Wile is now working on an exhibition on the celebrity portrait in 18th century London and Paris. Tonight's talk, Enlightened Inspiration, Inventing Genius in the First Age of Celebrity, will take as its point of departure François André Vincent's wonderful portrait of Desforges to explore the demand for images of new public figures. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Aaron Wile.
Thank you, Annabelle, for that introduction, and thank you, everyone, for being here. It's such an honor to be giving the Rosenberg Lecture, and I learned today, actually, this is the 20th anniversary. I'm the 20th speaker, so that's even more of an honor, and I'm very grateful and very honored to be here. So, what does a genius look like? For most of us, a genius probably looks something like this. Albert Einstein, father of relativity, was of course a great mind, but it's not simply because of that he's become the very face of genius. Einstein made his discoveries in an age that witnessed an explosion of mass media. Movies, magazines, newspapers, radio, television. Mass media shaped his image and propelled it to the forefront of public consciousness. Einstein, in other words, wasn't simply a scientist, he was a celebrity. Most of the public had and still has very little understanding of relativity, and I certainly don't, but they were fascinated by the man, his opinions, his daily life, his charisma, all of which mass media made available for public consumption. And therein lies the essence of his celebrity. Tonight, I want to explore the origins of the celebrity genius and its image. As you may have guessed, given that I'm giving the Rosenberg Lecture, I want to locate those origins in 18th century France. The number of artworks depicting great writers and thinkers, of people who were considered or considered themselves to be geniuses, exploded at this time. And yet scholars have given surprisingly little attention to these works. Much of the scholarship that does exist tends to consider them in very cerebral ways, for example, as embodiments of Enlightenment philosophical ideas. Tonight, I want to consider the representation of genius from a slightly less lofty perspective, that of celebrity. Now, as it happens, both our modern understandings of genius and celebrity culture emerged during the second half of the 18th century. And what I'm going to suggest in today's lecture is that it was the collision of these two phenomena in Paris one of the most important artistic, intellectual, and economic capitals of the Atlantic world, that propelled the effort to define an image of celebrity, to instill an idea of what genius should look like in the public consciousness. And I'll also add, London plays a major role in this story, but that's going to wait for another lecture, though I will nod towards it at the end of my lecture. Going to anchor my discussion around one of the great masterpieces of the Rosenberg Collection, François André Vincent's portrait of Pierre-Jean-Baptiste Choudard, also known by his pen name, Desforges. Desforges was an actor, dramatist, and all-around man of letters whose work was just coming into vogue when this portrait was painted. Some of you are probably thinking, I've never heard of this man. Is he really a genius? And in fact, whether or not he was a genius is beside the point. We're going to see how everything in Vincent's portrait, Desforges' clothing, his pose, his expression, was carefully calculated to convince us that he's a genius. This effort, and its relation to a burgeoning culture of celebrity, will be the first topic I'll address tonight. Then, moving away from Vincent's portrait to images of other, more familiar geniuses of the age, I'd like to explore some of the complications, the problems at the intersection of genius and celebrity created. As we'll see, genius and celebrity fed off each other, but they often found themselves at odds. And the conflict between the two comes to a head in portraiture. Desforges didn't comment on his portrait, as far as I know, but some of the greatest writers of the 18th century, Voltaire, Denis Diderot, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, these are the heavy hitters of the Enlightenment, did comment extensively and quite eloquently on theirs, and for the most part, they found them lacking. What's at stake in their dissatisfaction with their likenesses, I want to show, is the fate of the private self on the public stage. If the task of portraiture is to capture the essence of the sitter, their character and their mind, and celebrity demands that those things become objects for public consumption, what happens when the sitter looks at his portrait and doesn't recognize himself? So, before we can get into this question, some background is in order. What did genius mean in 18th century France? 18th century French society worshipped at the altar of genius. Genius, its origins, its nature, its powers, was endlessly discussed and debated, and geniuses themselves achieved an unprecedented level of social prestige and public prominence. Now, it's hard for us to imagine today, but people like Voltaire and Rousseau were the most famous people alive, more famous than any actor or musician. Genius is a very old concept, but it's only during the 18th century that our modern understanding of it emerges. Before the 18th century, genius, understood as extraordinary intellectual power, was thought to be an external force, a spirit, an angel, or a demon, depending on who you asked, that acted on or even possessed a person. And in fact, the Latin word genius means a kind of guardian angel or spirit. And that usage survives into the 18th century. And here I'm showing you an oil sketch by the artist Gabriel de Saint-Aubin called The Genius of Voltaire, and to give you an idea of this. So we see Voltaire, the great philosopher, poet, and playwright. We'll see a lot of him tonight, actually. He's shown composing his epic poem, La Pucelle. And all around him, you can see little angels who are stoking his minds. These are genii, geniuses. But by the time this work was made, a quite different understanding of genius had taken hold. Genius was no longer something you had, but something you were. And so for the first time, we see men, and for the most part, they are men rather than women, I'll touch on that later, being called geniuses. So one no longer said, he has genius, he is a genius. And this signals a fairly major shift. The exceptional intellect or ability of genius was now thought to come from within a person and define who they were. And these geniuses were not like other men. According to the entry on genius in Diderot and d'Alembert's encyclopedia, published in 1757, genius seems to alter the nature of things. Its character expands over all it touches. It bursts over the past and the present and lights the future. It precedes its century but cannot follow it. That's a tall order. The genius, especially the genius writer of artists, was kind of redefined as a kind of demiurge. Since the Renaissance, the task of poetry and all arts was to imitate nature. But in the 18th century, great artists and writers were thought to create, kind of like God, something new and outstanding out of nothing. This new creator genius became a cultural hero, lionized by a public which stood in awe of his tremendous powers. As the historian Derek McMahon, whose important work on the history of genius I've been drawing on here, has argued, the cult of genius emerged in response to the larger cultural and intellectual transformations of modernity, notably secularization. In a disenchanted world transformed by the discoveries of the scientific revolution, where God was no longer thought to intervene actively in human affairs, the cult of genius provided a kind of alternate religion. By penetrating into the mysteries of nature, or by creating beautiful works of art out of nothing, the genius stood in for an absent God, fulfilling a collective social need for magic and enchantment. The cult of genius produced a wide variety of works of art, that not all of which have anything to do with celebrity. Some of these were grand-scaled, state-sponsored monuments. The most ambitious of these was a project launched by this man, the Comte d'Angivillers, director of the king's works under Louis XV. And this project was known as the Grands Hommes, the Great Men of France. Starting in 1774, d'Angivillers began commissioning life-size statues of great men taken from modern French history, from the country's most important sculptors. The purpose, d'Angivillers wrote, was to celebrate men distinguished, quote, by their virtues, talents, and genius. And there were the usual panoply of military heroes and politicians, I'm showing you two here, but also included were great writers and thinkers, like the playwright Molière by Caffieri and the philosopher Montesquieu by Clodion, which I'm showing you here. The function of these monuments was essentially commemorative. All of the men depicted were dead, and propagandistic. Essentially, the state was co-opting images of the most famous minds and heroes of French history to inspire patriotism and forge a collective image of French cultural greatness. So accordingly, Molière and Montesquieu's portraits are as much abstractions, ideals of intellectual greatness, as portraits of individuals. The particular here cedes to the general in the service of the construction of national memory. Vincent's portrait of Desforges, I think, is a slightly different beast. Now, allowing for the fact that we're dealing with a different medium, in Vincent's painting, in contrast to Caffieri's statue, we have the illusion of an encounter with a specific individual, and it's strikingly intimate. Desforges is sitting what we can presume to be his personal study. He's half-dressed. We seem to have caught him in a private moment of intense reflection or inspiration. So to understand what's going on here and what it means, I'm suggesting we need to consider another side to the cult of genius, one which has nothing to do with state propaganda or lofty philosophical ideas, the genius as celebrity. In 18th century France, the public's intense fascination with great writers and thinkers like Voltaire or Rousseau often became detached from any engagement with their advanced philosophical ideas or appreciation for the literary merits of their work. These people were the equivalent of rock stars of their day. They were deluged with fan letters, mobbed wherever they went. The public, what they were interested in was the geniuses as people, as individuals, and they wanted to feel a kind of personal connection with them. Now, like genius, celebrity as we know it first enters the stage in the 18th century. 18th century specialists will know that we always like to say everything first emerged in the 18th century, but it's true in this case. And that's where the title first stage of celebrity comes from in my talk. There have, of course, always been famous people. They've been famous people since the dawn of civilization. But as the French historian Antoine Lilti has argued in a brilliant book from 2014, to which I'm heavily indebted here, celebrity represents a new, specifically modern form of public recognition that takes shape around 1750. Lilti highlights three features that distinguish celebrity. First, unlike older forms of fame, like glory, which were directed towards posterity, and you can think of the Great Men series as, in terms of glory, as perpetuating an image of greatness for generations to come, celebrity is directed towards the present, and it can be ephemeral. Second, celebrities are also famous to a wider public than famous figures of the past, who might be famous in elite intellectual circles or in restricted geographic area. Celebrity touches all levels of society, and as a result, celebrities become subject to public opinion, so everyone weighs in on the celebrity. And finally, celebrities aren't necessarily famous for what they do, but who they are. Now, they may have accomplished great works or thought up great ideas, and that may be why they became famous in the first place, but their celebrity rests on fascination with something more personal. The public wants intimate contact with the celebrity, and the public's intense fascination could be quite divorced from what they do, as I said. And there's a wonderful quip from the commentator Louis-Sébastien Mercier about Voltaire's return to Paris in 1778 after a 28-year exile that really captures this dynamic. He writes, "An epic curiosity made people rush to catch sight of Voltaire's face, as if the soul of a writer were no longer in his writings, but in the way he looked." So given this desire for the likeness, for the image of celebrities, it's not surprising that portraits come to play a major role in this nascent celebrity culture. Celebrity drives demand for portraits, and portraits come in turn to create and disseminate celebrity. So, for example, if you want to see Voltaire but can't get to Paris, or you saw Voltaire but couldn't get close enough, or you want to see him again, you go see or buy a portrait of him, like these by Maurice Quentin de la Tour and Jean-Antoine Houdon. And these provide the illusion of intimacy, that desire for contact, not just with the man's ideas, but with the man himself that drives celebrity. The celebrity portrait, which is the subject of the exhibition that Annabelle mentioned in her introduction, differs from earlier forms of portraits in many respects. Perhaps most importantly, the celebrity portrait reaches a far wider audience than portraits traditionally had. In the 16th and 17th centuries, when portraits first become a major genre, defining genre of Western art, portraits were viewed in relatively restricted spaces, in palaces or private homes. The celebrity portrait is made for the public. Now, as many of you probably know, the 18th century gives rise to all sorts of new venues for the public consumption of art, and Paris is the epicenter of this activity. For the first time, art becomes a truly public affair. We see, for example, the birth of public exhibitions, the most important of which is the Salon, the state-sponsored public art exhibition held every 2 years in the Salon Carré of the Louvre, where members of the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture displayed their latest creations. Anyone who paid the small entrance fee could scrutinize the portraits on display, and critics, there's another novelty of the 18th century, could publish their impressions of them and also gossip about the celebrities. Now, in addition to new exhibition spaces, the art market explodes during this period. We see artists not only making art specifically for the market, but also making copies of their works for sale. And this was especially true of one of the great celebrity portraitists of the time, the sculptor Jean-Antoine Houdon, who made versions of his portrait busts in different media and which cost different amounts based on the medium and his involvement. And here I'm showing you different versions of one of his busts of Voltaire, that you see them in marble and in bronze. And further down the scale, we also see relatively inexpensive printed reproductions of popular sitters circulating wildly. And these prints, in turn, could be used as models for all sorts of objects, like snuff boxes, tea sets, and jewelry. No one better exemplifies the new conditions of making and seeing portraits than Ben Franklin, one of the great 18th century geniuses and probably the most depicted person of the 18th century. Franklin came to Paris in 1776 as the American ambassador, and he very quickly becomes a public sensation. He's celebrated as the epitome of genius for his discoveries about electricity and lightning, and as the embodiment of enlightened philosophical ideas for his involvement with the American Revolution. And people really can't get enough of him. Newspapers report on his comings and goings. He's invited to every house that matters, and most importantly, portraits of him circulate everywhere. The most famous of these is by Joseph Duplessis, which is displayed in the Salon of 1779. I'm showing you that here. And of course, the portrait is immediately reproduced in print, but also other artists are making portraits of him to satisfy an insatiable public demand, and images of him begin circulating in every possible medium. So you see medallions, bust and biscuit porcelain, but also jewelry and teacups. In 1779, he reports on the phenomenon in a letter to his daughter back in Philadelphia, and this is such a wonderful quote. "The clay medallion you say you gave to Mr. Hopkinson was the first of its kind made in France. A variety of others have been made since of different sizes. some to be set in the lids of snuff boxes, and some so small as to be worn as rings, and the numbers sold are incredible. These, with the pictures, busts, and prints of which copies upon copies are spread everywhere, have made your father's face as well known as that of the moon. So making your face as well known as that of the moon, that's the essence of the celebrity portrait. That's why portraiture comes to play such a key role in the culture of celebrity at this moment. And this was the climate in which Desforges' portrait was painted. Desforges, of course, had nowhere near the level of fame that Franklin or Voltaire enjoyed, but a portrait deployed correctly could help manage his public image and propel him into a higher stratum of fame. After all, if you want the public to believe you're a genius like Voltaire, and you want them to attend your plays and buy your books, it helps to look like a genius. You need to market yourself as a genius. What makes Vincent's portrait of Desforges, which I should add was displayed at the Salon of 1789, such a successful portrait of genius, is that it taps into contemporary ideas and conversations about genius. Vincent shows the writer at work, dressed informally. He's in the act of creating, which is, of course, the defining activity of genius. But that's not enough to conclude that he is a genius. So compare Vincent's portrait to this one from 1747 of Louis XV's secretary Marc de Villiers by Joseph Aved. Like Desforges, de Villiers also seems to have been caught in a private moment in his study. He's reading Homer's Iliad. And of course, that's a very erudite activity, but this portrait wouldn't, I think, have communicated his genius as unambiguously as Vincent's portrait of Desforges did. And there are two things that are different about Vincent's portrait and mark the difference between a man of letters, like de Villiers, and a quote-unquote genius, like Desforges here, his clothes and his expression. So let's start with Desforges' clothing. Both Desforges and de Villiers are shown en déshabillé. They're dressed informally for comfort, as one would in the privacy of his study. And this was a convention for depicting men of letters in the 18th century. If you were a gentleman scholar, you like to be shown dressed casually, reading your books or writing. But note that de Villiers is wearing a splendid dressing gown of imported silk. Desforges' clothing, by contrast, are quite plain. He's got a voluminous white linen shirt opened at the neck with pleated cuffs undone. And he's got a sturdy cotton waistcoat in beige. This is a more significant difference than it might appear. Any genius worth his salt didn't wear showy, expensive dressing gowns. In fact, one of the great geniuses of the age, Denis Diderot, who is famous as a novelist, philosopher, and co-editor of the encyclopedia, from which I quoted earlier, meditated at length on the perils of luxurious dressing gowns in an essay from 1769 titled "Regrets on Parting with My Old Dressing Gown." The essay was prompted by a gift of a beautiful scarlet robe. But the problem, he tells us, is that as soon as he put it on, he became dissatisfied with the relative shabbiness of his surroundings, causing him to spend money he didn't have. So if you have a beautiful dressing gown, then you also need a chair to go with it. But even worse than that, Diderot's new dressing gown called into question his very identity as a serious writer and thinker. While his old robe was stained with dust and ink, reflecting, quote, the life of a man of letters, the writer, the man who works, his new gown gave him, and I'm quoting again, the air of a rich good-for-nothing. No one knows who I am. So the robe really isn't so much about money, it's about who Diderot perceives himself to be, about his own sense of self as a thinker and writer, which this gift has destabilized. Now, Diderot, who is also the greatest art critic of his age, broached this theme in a critique he wrote on his own portrait by Michel Van Loo, which you see on the screen, and which was displayed at the Salon of 1767. Van Loo's portrait and Vincent's are, as you can tell, strikingly similar. Both show their sitters seated at a desk and set against a neutral gray background. They're pausing to reflect in the midst of writing, quills at the ready. And I think it's likely that Vincent was making a deliberate reference to Van Loo's famous portrait, which was quite famous by the time he made it. But there's one especially striking difference, and that's Diderot's clothing. He's wearing a very luxurious silk dressing gown, not so different from the one he'd write about a couple of years later. Diderot finds it totally inappropriate And he jokes that it's, quote, so luxurious as to ruin the poor man of letters should the tax collector levy payment against his dressing gown. Diderot's point again is that real geniuses don't need to be draped in luxurious fabrics. Indeed, that fancy clothing is detrimental to serious thought, a vain indulgence that only distracts from the philosophical enterprise. And we also see similar thoughts from Rousseau and Franklin. All those people forswear luxurious clothing. So with this context in mind, the meaning of Desforges' sartorial choices becomes clearer. His casual clothing not only shows a man at work, it signals his adherence to the ideals articulated by people like Diderot and Rousseau. Genius transcends society's suffocating expectations in its empty pursuit of luxury and status. So Desforges has thrown off the artifice of wigs and expensive clothes and makeup, all the things that signify social rank and power. We're meant to understand that he's a man who doesn't care how others see him because he's authentic, devoted to the higher calling of literature. And of course, it's easy to style a genius, but how do you convey what actually makes a genius, his mind? Remember that with celebrity, the object of the public's fascination and scrutiny is the famous person's private self. So the task of the celebrity portrait, then, is to create an image of what the literary scholar Joseph Roach calls public intimacy, the private self presented for public consumption and the illusion of availability that goes with it. Vincent begins to create this illusion by showing Desforges working in his personal study. We're invited into his inner sanctum, almost intruding on a private moment. But the successful celebrity portrait had to make visible something more intimate, the extraordinary movements of the genius's mind. So with that imperative in mind, I want to turn to what I think is Desforges' most extraordinary quality, his expression. Now, the expression of emotion in European art had long been established as the surest means to convey a figure's inner state. But in portraiture in the Western tradition, sitters don't typically express strong emotion. So take a look at Ovid's portrait of De Villiers again. Ovid has succeeded in creating a strong illusion of inner life. We have a sense that something's going on behind those eyes, but we don't have any access to the specific goings-on of his mind. He may be thinking ingenious thoughts, but it's hard to say. Vincent's portrait is quite different. His face is alive with intense feeling. His eyes are raised, and you can't appreciate it in this image, but when you see it in person, you can almost see the tears in it. His cheeks are flushed. His mouth is slightly open. In the 18th century, genius was thought to manifest above all as a feeling, what was known as enthusiasm, an overwhelming emotion or mental transport. According to Diderot, when the genius is creating, the mind, quote, becomes engrossed, disturbed, agitated, tormented. The imagination heats up, passion rises and grows disturbed. The poet feels the moment of enthusiasm. It announces itself in him with a shudder that sets out from his chest and passes quickly and deliciously through his entire body. Sounds like fun, doesn't it? Now, in an earlier age, enthusiasm was a religious emotion. It meant a kind of divine inspiration. And there was already in the 18th century an established tradition from which to draw, showing saints and other holy figures in the throes of enthusiasm. And here I'm showing you as an example, Guido Reni's St. Jerome composing the Gospels. And he's shown in a state of ravishment as he receives inspiration from the angels. And you'll remember, this is how genius was originally supposed to work. It was an external force, a spirit or an angel that acted on a person. And so Vincent's portrait owes something to this tradition, even if not in conscious ways. But the key difference here is that the enthusiasm is coming from within. It doesn't have anything to do with God or religion. And that's, again, signaling that difference quite literally that I was explaining earlier with the emergence of the modern notion of genius. And also, by the time Vincent painted his portrait, there was already a tradition of depicting geniuses in a state of transport. So consider, for example, this portrait of the celebrated composer Christophe Willibald Gluck, painted in 1775 by Joseph Duplessis. Unless you're an opera buff, you may not have heard of Gluck, but he was a major sensation in Paris and famous for transforming and reforming opera. And this was painted at the height of his fame, when he was the toast of the city. And here we see him with the same upturned gaze, the same flushed cheeks as he's composing at his harpsichord. Vincent was clearly looking towards precedents like this to establish Desforges as an equally powerful mind. We're shown the genius at work and allowed to participate in the moment of inspiration. So what Vincent so skillfully delivers in this portrait is the kind of intimacy demanded of celebrity portraits. This, again, it's at the same time that this portrait conjures up the mystique of genius, it puts us on very personal, even private terms with it. But what happens when portraits become too intimate? What happens when your private sense of yourself doesn't match up with the public representation of that self? And who ultimately gets to decide what the image of your most intimate self looks like and who gets to see it? These are some of the questions I want to explore next in the second part of my talk. Now, typically, not only did a sitter typically commission their portrait, but they also had a great deal of say about what it would look like and how it would be displayed and to whom. But in the 18th century, celebrity creates a new dynamic. Now, celebrity portraits, remember, are made to first and foremost to feed public demand. Fans want access to their favorite stars, and portraits facilitate that, as we've seen. Even if Desforges commissioned the portrait himself, he did so to satisfy that desire, to shape his image on the public stage. So again, this portrait is displayed in the public exhibition of the salon for everyone to see. Now the problem, though, is that once your image and likeness enters the public sphere, you risk losing control of it. Unauthorized copies of your portrait can be made, for example, or even worse, portraits can be made that you have nothing to do with. Artists, we see in this period, begin creating images without the sitter's consent because there's a hunger and therefore a market for likenesses of famous people. And yet they have no say about what it looks like or how it portrays them. This did happen to Desforges, who never achieved that level of fame, but it was experienced by some of the most famous writers of the period. So consider the case of Voltaire, whom we've met before. He not only has to contend with a huge number of portraits of him circulating around Europe, and these are two Houdin busts we saw earlier, but he also, and this is what makes him quite different, he has an artist who devotes his entire career to creating portraits of him and who makes a kind of cottage industry out of it. And this artist is someone you may not have heard of before. His name is Jean Hubert, and he's so devoted to Voltaire that even in his own self-portrait, he shows himself drawing Voltaire's portrait. Hubert was Voltaire's neighbor in Fresnay, Switzerland, where the philosopher settled in 1760 after his exile from Paris. Hubert and Voltaire were friends, or at least associates, but Voltaire disliked Hubert's portraits quite a bit, and here I'm showing you three. Give you an idea, you can judge for yourself. His most famous image is probably this one, Voltaire's Morning, or Le Lever, which shows the philosopher rising out of his bed, struggling to put his pants on as he dictates a letter to his secretary. Now, this, as you can imagine, was not commissioned by Voltaire himself. It was commissioned actually by a Voltaire superfan, no less than Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, who also corresponded with Voltaire. And it was part of a suite of paintings she commissioned showing the philosopher's domestic life. And I'll show you a couple here. So here we see Voltaire welcoming his guests, Voltaire taming a horse, Voltaire playing chess, and Voltaire taking breakfast. This is a far different vision of a genius writer from the inspired creator shown, for example, in Vincent's portrait. Now, when the paintings arrive finally, Catherine is particularly taken with Voltaire's Morning. She writes in a letter to the Baron von Grimm, who was friends with Hubert and likely helped facilitate the commission, quote, "It's the only one that makes me burst out laughing. This one for me is original. The vivacity of his character and the impatience of his imagination makes it so he can't do more than two things at once." So she's laughing basically that he can't manage to put on his pants because he's so engrossed in this letter he's dictating. And it's actually a really fascinating remark and strikes at what makes this portrait a celebrity portrait. Catherine's not interested in Voltaire's ideas. She doesn't want to see him as the great genius that he was. Instead, she wants something far more intimate from these images. She wants to see the great man as a man. And it's really not so different from People magazine when you think about it. Even someone as powerful as the Empress of Russia wants to see that stars, they're just like us. The story of this painting gets even more interesting, though. So according to a gossipy article in the Correspondance littéraire, a cultural newsletter that circulated among the highest echelons of European society, Hubert also planned to have the paintings engraved and offered the complete suite as a subscription. But before he could, Voltaire's Morning was stolen from him and an unauthorized print was made from it. At the bottom of this unauthorized print were added unflattering verses. And I won't read them all to you, but I'll quote the article in the Correspondance littéraire, which gives us the gist, and it's that Voltaire is showing his ass, D'Alembert, the editor of the encyclopedia, is kissing it, and Fréon, this is Voltaire's enemy in the world of letters, is spanking it. So this portrait, already unflattering, has been turned into satire. As you can imagine, Voltaire is not pleased. He already doesn't like that Hubert is making these unauthorized images of him. Now, after this painting begins circulating, he writes in a letter that Hubert has, quote, ridiculed me from one end of Europe to the other. So is the painting, leave the print aside, but is this painting caricature? And where do we draw the line between a caricature and a portrait? Voltaire, as we've seen, thought this image fell squarely into the camp of caricature, but the article in the Correspondance littéraire assures us that the image is, quote, rigorously and historically accurate. And in that same article, Hubert published an open letter to Voltaire defending his portraits. He writes, "Don't you understand that your portrait needs shadows?" He's talking shadows in a metaphorical sense. "That it needs contrast, the light that no one could bear otherwise. Don't you understand that Henry IV and Benedict XIV would be less sweet in our memory if one was always king and the other the head of the church? I've told you 100 times that I know precisely the dose of ridicule that is needed to feed your glory." And this is another really extraordinary statement, I think. It's not enough, Hubert is saying, simply to show Voltaire doing the kind of things we think of a genius writer doing, writing or creating. The public also needs a more human, more accessible portrait, because when people see that he's not simply a great mind, they love him more. Whether or not Hubert persuaded Voltaire, I don't think he did, he makes clear that fame had become personal. If you're a famous genius, the nature of fame in the 18th century means that you're likely also a celebrity. And you need to play by the rules of the game and give the public what it wants. And even if you don't want intimate images circulating, artists will produce them anyway because that's what the public wants to see. And the result in Hubert's portraits is that the link between genius and celebrity, which is so skillfully managed in Vincent's portrait Desforges, has been severed. There's nothing here that hints at Voltaire's extraordinary mind. He's really here only as celebrity. And it's one thing to show Voltaire as a man like any other in a small painting or print, but the uneasy relationship between celebrity and genius would also haunt him in a more ambitious monument, one specifically meant to celebrate his outstanding achievements in the world of letters. Things get interesting here. So in 1770, a group of 17 people, among whom were Diderot, D'Alembert, and other prominent philosophers and writers, gathered for their weekly dinner at the home of Madame Necker. I'm showing you here a somewhat anachronistic and fantastical painting of the salon, a gathering of another prominent salonière, Madame Geoffrin, where guests are gathered to read the latest play Voltaire. And I'm just showing you to give you a sense of what these might have looked like and what prominent role Voltaire played, even though he was in exile in Switzerland. Now, over the course of this evening, it was decided that Voltaire, who was admired as the patriarch of advanced thinkers of the Enlightenment, should be honored with a monument, a life-size sculpture. The sculptor Jean-Baptiste Pigalle, one of the most respected artists of his day, was enlisted, and a subscription campaign was launched to pay for it. Now, already this is a key aspect of the sculpture and its relationship to celebrity. This isn't a state-sponsored commission, as most monuments were, but one driven by people who were essentially his fans. This is a pretty new way to commission art. And that's not the only novelty. A monument to a living person who wasn't a king hadn't really been made before. Portraits were one thing, we've seen several, but a public monument to a living writer artist was new. And Pigalle was wading into uncharted waters, and this is what he produced 6 years later. Now, you'll notice immediately that Pigalle chose to depict Voltaire completely in the buff. And of course, there's a long tradition of sculpting people in nude that goes back to antiquity, but bodies in these works are invariably idealized. But Voltaire, who's around 80 when the sculpture was made, is shown as he actually looked. He's old, withered, and decrepit. And there's a startling intimacy about this portrait, which it's hard to convey in a slide, but he's life-size and there's no pedestal. He confronts us directly in our own space. And I think it's really not such a stretch to imagine him getting up to put on his pants as he did in Hubert's painting. So is this what a monument to a great thinker should look like? To both Voltaire's allies and enemies, the answer was a resounding no. Even before the sculpture was completed, the model was universally condemned. Fréron, Voltaire's enemy, whom we met earlier, spanking Voltaire in the poem, was pleased to report in a letter that the statue was hideous and joked, quote, "It's not really important that posterity can now count Monsieur de Voltaire's ribs and know that he has very saggy nipples." Similarly, an anonymous letter from a few months earlier, later published in the Mémoires Secrètes, a newsletter that chronicled gossip about the era's celebrities and also published art criticism, condemned Pigault's sculpture for its overly naturalistic depiction. The letter says, "It's hard to know where to put this statue because it will always be repugnant, especially to women, due to the hideous sight of an emaciated corpse." So again, we have this scrutiny of people's bodies, which is still kind of the essence of celebrity culture. Now, it's been argued that Voltaire's vulnerable nudity embodies an ideal of free and equal intellectual exchange that characterized the Republic of Letters in the Enlightenment. And I think there's some truth to this claim, but I think the sense of failure that hung around this portrait, even before its completion, stems from a tension between two kinds of public recognition, glory and celebrity. A sculpted monument is the archetypal portrait of glory, meant to consecrate the individual and perpetuate their memory. There is, I think, an interesting parallel to be made with another famously failed portrait, Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun's portrait of Marie Antoinette from 1783. Now, I don't think this slide comparison has ever been made before, and many of you are probably thinking, what could these portraits have to do with each other? In an important sense, both people here, both Marie Antoinette and Voltaire, are celebrities, and this is new territory for writers and queens alike. A queen was traditionally an entirely public figure. Much of her routine was ceremonial, and it took place in the public eye, and she was the mother of the nation, and that was her role. Marie Antoinette famously rebels, or infamously rebels against this expectation. She wants to live like a private person, and she spends an increasing amount of time in private spaces of retreat with a small coterie of friends. But because she's queen, that doesn't quite work, and the public begins to fixate on her private life, her supposed affairs, her supposed sexual immodesty, her marital relations, her fashion choices. In other words, she becomes a celebrity. Now, Marie Antoinette acknowledges and plays with this in her public presentation, but in this case, it backfires. In this portrait, Vigée-Lebrun paints her in a casual chemise dress, which Marie Antoinette had made the height of fashion around this time. But queens weren't supposed to look like this. They were supposed to wear dresses like this, dresses that subsumed them in their public role, gave no sense of the body underneath. So when Vigée-Lebrun's portrait was shown at the Salon, people were scandalized because she's shown effectively in her underwear in transparent muslin, and she's basic for all intents and purposes for her audiences, nude. That's an indecent way for a queen to appear, and to her critics, it confirmed rumors about her sexual deviance. Very quickly, it was taken down and replaced with a more appropriate portrait. So I hope it's clear why I've brought these two works together. The issue here is the introduction of celebrity, and with it, public intimacy on a quite literal level into portraiture, which interrupts its traditional functions of commemoration and celebration of established social roles. And the result is a kind of crisis about what portraits should look like and what and who they're for. At the core of this crisis is the relationship between the portrait and the self. The successful portrait in the Western tradition is supposed to capture something of the inner essence of a person. But the celebrity portrait makes that essence an object of public consumption. So another question that this raises is, what happens when you look at a portrait but you don't recognize yourself? All celebrities of the 18th century, whether they're actors or society figures or queens, had to confront this problem. But it's a particularly fascinating problem with celebrity geniuses like Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau, because being writers, they comment on their portraits and their sense of alienation from their own likenesses. This feeling of misrecognition and alienation's new territory for portraits, because I'm not talking simply about likeness, about creating an accurate likeness. The problem goes deeper. These portraits risk opening up a gap between the way sitters perceive themselves and the way the public does, between the person and the persona. And in fact, this is precisely what happens when Diderot saw his portrait by Van Loo, which we looked at earlier. "Ce n'est pas moi, this is not me," he complained in his review. And the problem went deeper than the fancy dressing gown. According to Diderot, Van Loo failed to make the operations of his extraordinary mind visible. Van Loo showed him, quote, pretty like a woman, leering, smiling, dainty, pursing his mouth to make him look captivating. This Diderot attributes to the conditions of the sitting in what's now one of the most famous passages in art criticism, and I'll read it to you now. Madame Van Loo came to chat with him while he was being painted, giving him that air and spoiling everything. So he's talking in the third person here. He should have been left alone, abandoned to his reveries. Then his mouth would have been partially open, his glance would have been distracted, focused on the distance, and the workings of his thoroughly preoccupied head would have been made legible on his face, and Michel Van Loo, would have produced a beautiful thing. So what he's asking for, in other words, is something that looked more like Vincent's portrait of Desforges. Now, for Diderot, remember, genius is fundamentally solitary, it's asocial. What Van Loo has captured is the superficial society man. Another way to say this is that Van Loo has portrayed him more as a celebrity than as a genius. And the gendered language here that Diderot's using, remember he says that Van Loo makes him look like an old flirt and a coquette. It's significant here. Celebrity was, from its origins, coded as a specifically feminine form of fame. This reflects anxieties about it, and obviously in a sexist way. But if glory was everlasting and belonged to the realm of men in action, celebrity was thought to be oftentimes superficial, ephemeral, intimate, and affected. So you can see now why it's so hard for a woman to be thought of as a genius at the moment. We really don't get depictions of women as geniuses until the beginning of the 19th century. In Van Loo's portrait, the gap between celebrity and genius, of course, isn't as extreme as in Hubert's images of Voltaire, but Diderot feels that his portrait fails precisely because it's too contaminated by worldly society and fame. Diderot is shown as an actor portraying genius and doing so badly, not as an exceptional mind. So what's at stake here, again, is the fate of the private self when one is a public figure. What does it mean to have your representation that purports to capture your inner essence and being ceded to another, the artist, and scrutinized by a wide public? Diderot, being Diderot, maintains a light posture to the gap between self and image in his portrait. But we enter a much darker territory when we turn to Rousseau, who was not only more famous, but more troubled than Diderot. And this is where I'm going to close my talk. The portrait in question is this one, painted by Alan Ramsay in 1766. It was painted in England, where Rousseau fled after he got in trouble for his radical ideas about politics and religion in France and Switzerland. And it was commissioned by his host, the philosopher and historian David Hume. Almost as soon as Rousseau arrived in London, relations between the two began to break down. Now, Rousseau, at this point, was beginning to slip into paranoia, and he was convinced he was the victim of an international conspiracy to smear him as a dangerous monster, and he believed that Hume had joined their ranks. And the portrait was part of the plot. This was his proof about Hume's real intentions. Rousseau laid out his case in his work, Rousseau, Judge of Jean-Jacques, more commonly known as the Dialogues, which he began in 1772 and completed 4 years later. In it, Rousseau defends his character and explains the true content of his work against those who distorted it, slandered it, or indeed never read it. The Dialogues have often been seen as the product of a man losing his mind, but Antoine Lilti has argued in his incisive analysis of it that it's fundamentally a self-portrait of a man alienated by his celebrity. It shows a man desperately trying to untangle the relationship among how he actually thought of himself, how he appeared in his books, and how others perceived him, and trying to get these things straight. Rousseau describes the genesis of this portrait and his reaction to it in a long passage that I'd like to quote at length, if you'll bear with me. Quote, "Hume desired that portrait as ardently as an earnest lover desires that of his mistress. By dint of importunities, he extracts Jean-Jacques' consent. Jean-Jacques is made to wear a very black hat, a very brown coat, and he's positioned in a very somber place. And there, in order to paint him seated, he's kept standing, bent over, leaning with one hand on a very low table, in a posture where his tightly tensed muscles modify his facial features. The result of all these precautions had to be the most unflattering portrait, even if it were faithful. Ramsay's portrait, Rousseau feels, makes him look tense, angry, and brooding, because he's been manipulated that way. And that's not how Rousseau saw himself. Rousseau saw himself as gentle, sensitive. So in the end, what Ramsay's doing is presenting a distortion of Rousseau's true self. And that's only the beginning of Rousseau's problems with this portrait. Rousseau continues, "During Jean-Jacques' sojourn in England, this portrait was engraved, published, sold everywhere without it being possible for him to see the engraving. He returns to France and learns that there's a portrait from England, from England is announced, famous, touted as a masterpiece of painting, of engraving, and above all, of likeness. He's finally able, not without difficulty, to see it. He trembles and says what he thinks of it. Everyone ridicules him. Hume, he concludes, has given him the face of a fearsome cyclops." So here we have Rousseau articulating the problem of the celebrity portrait I touched on earlier. He's lost control of his image, of the right to say who he is before the public. And he continues, "These disfigured copies are the work of bad workmen who are greedy and not the product of distinguished artists. They are not loudly extolled all over Europe. These portraits are not announced in public papers. They're not displayed in residences adorned with glass and frames. They're left to rot on the quays or to decorate the rooms in cabarets and barbershops." So for Rousseau, the way the public uses his image amounted to a kind of violence. The endlessly reproduced and abused portrait becomes an embodiment of his alienation from his public persona and the violation he felt from the public's endless fascination with him. Facing a public whom he felt didn't understand him, couldn't see who he really was, he found himself subsumed by his own representation. In his protestations against Ramsay's portrait, Rousseau's ultimately, in Lilty's eloquent words, a man fighting as if robbed of himself against self-delusion in a maelstrom of innumerable representations of Jean-Jacques. For Rousseau, the celebrity portrait is ultimately tragic. This is a man who almost single-handedly made authenticity the defining virtue of modern man. And yet when he looks at his own portrait, he sees a stranger, a monster come to life, lumbering through Paris and London, claiming Rousseau's name as his own. And in many ways, Rousseau's battle with his own image is a cautionary tale for us. In our burgeoning age of AI, in a world already saturated with celebrity, we're all at risk of losing control of our images. Social media has given us unprecedented power to shape our image, to don new masks and identities at will, and broadcast them around the world. Everyone can have their 15 minutes of fame now, whether or not they're a genius or an actor, a singer, or anyone of any talent. But now, with artificial intelligence, our images and likenesses can be co-opted and manipulated in ways that Rousseau could never have imagined. If we're not careful, we'll all find ourselves stalked by our own monstrous doubles, confronted by counterfeit selves who speak and act in our names. Rousseau's alienation may soon be our own. Thank you. I believe there's a little bit of time for questions.
Yes, if you have a question, we'll come around with a mic, so please raise your hand if you do.
Thank you so much. This was such a fascinating talk. I was wondering if you could talk about the date of the Vincent portrait.
Yes.
The date is right under the signature, 1789, and I was wondering if you could talk through the visual markers of genius during the Ancien regime versus the French Revolution, and if that changes at all, and how politics affect notions of genius and celebrity.
It's a complicated question. Let me go back to the portrait. I purposely did not mention the date or the or the revolution, and it's a very complicated question. I think that's part of the reason that this portrait may not have been more remarked upon. I mean, the thing with this portrait, it's participating in culture of celebrity. I don't know, and I think it's actually a quite convincing image, but we don't have much evidence that it actually does much to augment Desforges' fame. And it's very difficult, I think, to articulate in any precise way the effect of the revolution on fame and celebrity. It makes it certainly much more I need to think more about that. I don't think there's a definitive answer there. I mean, really, when we see the dynamics of celebrity changing is with Romanticism. That creates a new kind of image of genius. So, surprisingly, there's less of a shift, I think, but I would like to think more about that. It's a good question.
Hi, I had a question about the limits of genius in 18th century France. Like, what does it extend to? Because you've done a beautiful job of laying out sort of what is essentially a mostly literary and slightly, maybe in Ben Franklin's case, a kind of a political celebrity too. But are you finding in your work that this concept of genius and then the added intersection with celebrity, does it work for scientists, for artists, for actors? How do different professions play into it?
I mean, I focused on writers because Desforges is a writer, and there's a certain set of conventions around showing the genius writing. But as the encyclopedia article says, genius has no limits, and you have all sorts of people called geniuses. So yes, scientists, actors, musicians, anyone who demonstrates an extraordinary ability can be a genius in this period.
Are the visual markers similar, kind of the upturned eyes and the sort of casual clothing, the tousled hair? Does that apply across types of genius, or is that specifically literary?
It does. Yeah, I mean, we saw it with the portrait of Gluck, for instance, very similar representation. With people like actors, it becomes a little more complicated. And of course, what is a scientist in the 18th century? That's a whole other question and complicated. So yes and no.
Great, thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm just thinking a little bit to kind of build on that about artists and self-portraiture. And can you think of examples of artists who very much used a campaign of self-portraiture to kind of convey or build their own sense of genius or celebrity?
Yes, I mean, that's quite complicated. So one aspect of this that I didn't get into that 18th century specialists are probably thinking about are Fragonard and specifically Mary Sheriff's analysis of his brushwork as a kind of index of genius, which I think is kind of the most eloquent analysis of artistic genius in this century. So I think artists have different needs at this period to appear. The status of the artist is very much in flux in the 18th century, and there's still kind of striving towards different forms of social prominence. And you really don't see artists presenting themselves as genius in this kind of very stereotypical way, and I think until a few decades later with Romanticism. But if you can think of a portrait, if you have any portraits in mind, I'd love to hear them. But
Actually, yes.
okay.
Sorry, Right, I'm just thinking you showed the Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun example, and she very much had a campaign of self-portraiture, so to speak, though she
Yes,
couldn't
but-
use the same form.
Well, so she is certainly a celebrity, but I don't think she fashions herself as a genius. I think she's quite conscious. She fashions herself as a mother, as a fashion celebrity, as a society woman. But I think she's quite conscious, and she's very conscious of her image, and quite consciously not depicting herself as a genius, because she's so skilled at reading and manipulating the social signs. But if you disagree, I'd love to debate you later.
So is there a female image of genius in your period?
It emerges really around 1800. And in fact, just a couple months ago, an article came out about the representation of female genius. But even there, it's allegorical. They're often depicted as a sibyl. And that doesn't appear really until the post-revolutionary period. So the question about what does the revolution do, I think it does allow for women to be depicted as geniuses for the first time, as certain social roles are destabilized. But in this pre-revolutionary period, it's very rare. So you see in England, Sarah Siddons called a genius sometimes, but it's otherwise it's quite rare. Because the way the discourse around genius is structured, it's structured in gendered terms, which necessarily makes it unavailable to women until something has to change.
Hi, I was curious if there's a conscious effort by these artists to kind of make more and more provocative works. And we saw that with the Voltaire work, with even Diderot's work. He didn't seem to consider it provocative, but it seems that, there's maybe this element of, as this celebrity grows, as there's this more and more consumption for it, even in the nature of the propaganda of the state, right? With Marie Antoinette and the tension between how she needs to be presented versus how she wants to be presented. Is there a conscious effort here? Or is there just something that kind of emerges out of everybody wanting to buy these?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to gauge quite how consciously provocative it was, but I think there's always has to be an element of provocation when you're dealing with this very crowded public sphere and everyone's jostling for attention. You do need to do something new and somewhat provocative. So I think certainly that's what is behind both the representations of Voltaire by Picot we saw and Vigée Lebrun's portrait of Marie Antoinette. But the problem when you're being provocative is that the risk is misfiring, which happened with these portraits.
Thank you. I wondered if you've come across instances of geniuses or celebrities commenting positively about their portraits, or do you think that would in any way reveal the very deliberate staging of those portraits and kind of undermine the genuine?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think genius, people like Voltaire and Diderot being who they were, because part of the pose of a genius is that you're kind of outside society, you're a critic. And so Rousseau and Diderot both had portraits they liked of themselves. I didn't show them, but Rousseau quite likes the pastel that Maurice Contin de la Tour made of him, which shows him smiling in a nice, just kind of a nice plain waistcoat. So yes, we do see that, and of course with celebrities more broadly, there are instances of actors requesting that copies be made of their works and that certain prints be circulated and sent to them and sent to their fans. So yes, there is, but I want to focus more on the problems. But if I had more time, I would have focused on the more successful images, at least in the eyes of their sitters.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question, if there is one. Anyone? All right.
Well, thank you so much to Dr. Wile for
Thank
being
you.
here. And thank you again to our trustees for being here as well and making this program possible. So have a great rest of your night.